The Breakfast Show 2020 on KBC English Service.
This morning we're looking at the considerable excitement about the news of significant success in the trials for a vaccine against COVID-19. But remember, experts are calling for caution and reminding us that we don't have a silver bullet yet. So maintain the basic hand washing, face mask and social distancing rules. So how far are we from a vaccine that will protect us from the virus? What are the risks for the people that volunteer to be part of the trials? How do the current trials for a vaccine against COVID-19 compare, for instance, with the elusive search for an HIV/AIDS vaccine in which Kenyan scientists have been prominently involved through the years? So many questions, and we're delighted to speak to one of the top experts in this field on the big conversation this hour. Our special guest is Professor Walter Jaoko, Professor of Medical Microbiology and Tropical Medicine, University of Nairobi, and Director of the Kenya AIDS Vaccine Initiative, KAVI. Last year, he was among the recipients of the 10 out of 10 International Awards at the House of Lords in London, UK, for his contribution to HIV/AIDS research in the past 30 years. So if there's an expert who can answer all the questions and clear the air and the doubt and concerns that you have regarding the development and safety and likely availability of a vaccine for COVID-19, then Professor Jaoko is most certainly that authority. Prof, last week it was revealed that the Oxford vaccine, which you mentioned briefly a while ago, was showing a strong immune response in adults in their 60s and 70s who are in the vulnerable category of the virus due to a weaker immune system. Would this news on the Oxford vaccine be a good development, and where does that leave younger people?
What they're having is what you call preliminary analysis, because they haven't even finished recruiting the study participants. So the vaccines that we are really keen on at the moment are the Moderna vaccines and the Pfizer vaccines. And it is hoped that they are the ones that will be able to give us solutions faster than the others. Remember, there are about 67 vaccines that are already in phase 3 trials. The world is really talking about these two frontliners. But the others, we have Sputnik vaccine in Russia. Nobody really knows much about it because the country is not sharing it much information. In China at the moment, they have a vaccine that they're even giving to their healthcare workers. But the ones that we know more about are the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. The Oxford vaccine will take a bit of time before we really get to know, probably in the beginning of the year.
We just heard you mention the term immune response, and we've also been hearing a lot about antibodies or antibody therapy, particularly in the US. Explain to us what these terms mean.
The way our bodies are created is that our bodies have a mechanism of fighting infection, fighting germs. When they see a virus or they see a bacteria, the germs are divided into different types. The big ones are what you call parasites. Parasites, I'm sure many of us know them. You know, people have intestinal worms. When you see a child passing these worms, those are parasites. They are germs, they're causing disease, but they're big. You can see them with your eyes. Next to that is what you call bacteria. Bacteria you can't see with your eyes, so you have to see with a microscope. But they're a little bigger. The smaller ones are called viruses. So HIV is a virus, COVID causing germ is a virus. It's a tinier one than bacteria. What happens is when your body is exposed to any of these germs, it has a natural way of trying to defend itself. So it produces things to try and fight this germ that it has seen. These things, we call them antibodies. Antibodies are more like a chemicals that have a way of going and binding or attaching to this germ and destroying it. But the body also produces what we call cells, and I'm sure many people are familiar with what we call white blood cells. Your blood has red blood cells that carries oxygen, but it also has white blood cells that fight germs. The white blood cells, the way they do it, unlike antibodies, which are chemicals and attack it that way, the white blood cells eat them. They eat the germ, and in the process of eating the germ, it destroys it. So these are what the antibodies and the cells that fight this disease is what we call immune response. You are responding, that is why it's called response. You are responding to the germ, and whatever the response that your body is mounting is an immune response, immunity, a defense response. And that is why when you hear people talking about immune response, we are talking about antibodies and we are talking about white blood cells.
Is there evidence, though, to prove that people that recover from COVID-19 develop an immune response that would prevent them from reinfection?
That is a problem. So what has happened is that people who have developed COVID and recovered have been followed. and a number of them have been found to have to have antibodies that are so specific that can fight the COVID virus, causing virus. The problem we have is that these antibodies are not long-lasting. So if you follow them for a period of time, their population, their numbers keep on decreasing and finally disappear. And it is for that reason you hear there are people who become reinfected with COVID. You find somebody had COVID, they recovered, but 3-4 months, 6 months later on, they get another attack of COVID. So we know that the immune responses that are generated from COVID are not long-lasting.
Is it possible that we will eventually then have several different vaccines for the coronavirus? You talked about there being like tens of these vaccines that are already at the stage 3 trials. Is it possible that we will have different vaccines for the coronavirus, all of which will have been granted the seal of approval?
That is what the world is looking for. Remember, COVID is just like any other disease. We have, just the way you have high blood pressure, you have hundreds of drugs that you use for treating high blood pressure. The fact that you find one drug that treats high blood pressure, you don't stop making other drugs. So you improve them, you get better drugs. It's the same thing with corona. So when we get COVID vaccine, and we are happy that we are getting more the merrier. So we get, it will also then make access to these vaccines much easier. Remember, at the moment, with only these 2 vaccines that have been shown now to be effective against COVID, the demand is impossible to be met. And that is why you hear the G8 and G20 leaders meeting this weekend, discussing and saying, how do we ensure fair and equitable distribution of these vaccines, because we're not going to have enough of them. So if we have more and different manufacturers with good and effective and safe vaccines available, the better.
Can you draw any parallels between the current search for a vaccine against the coronavirus and the elusive search for a vaccine against HIV/AIDS?
The thing about research on vaccines is for people to realize that the research is so varied. HIV is a completely different virus. HIV is a very complicated virus. It changes very fast. It is so varied from different parts of the world. The type of HIV that we have here is slightly different from what you find in Europe. It's different from what you find in South America. It's different from even what you find in South Africa. So for example, our main vaccine, HIV type here, is what we call a type A. If you go to Europe, you'll find a different type, and so on and so forth. And it keeps on changing very, very fast. So HIV vaccine research is more complicated than a COVID vaccine research. Let me just remind you again that different diseases, if you look at the time, from the time when a germ that causes a particular disease was first discovered to the time that a vaccine against that germ was developed, it is so varied. There are some it took only 2 or 3 years. There are some that it took many, many years. Hepatitis took many years. HIVs, many years, and we still haven't found any. But COVID, within a year, we have already found it. Why? Because the viruses are very different. The mechanisms in which they cause infection is very different. So it's hard to draw a parallel between HIV and COVID, just because the viruses are so different.
Since HIV was first identified in 1984 and there was hope that a vaccine would be developed in a maximum of 2 years, and here we are 36 years later, you're saying it's about priority and difference of the viruses?
You know, when HIV started, people did not fully understand it, and so when you hear about people promising you'll get vaccines in 2 years, I remember one of the presidents of the US, Bill Clinton, said 10 years they'll be able to have a vaccine. All those were really guesses. But the more we learnt about it, the way it kept on changing, we realized that it was not as easy as people were saying.
So, Prof, the only other African country where trials for a vaccine for COVID-19 are taking place is South Africa. Any idea how those trials are faring?
At the moment, we still don't have details about how those particular trials are faring. So it is South Africa, and now because of the Oxford vaccine, so Kenya is also into the picture. But we still don't have any. We're expecting to get some preliminary results at the beginning of the year.
What do you make of yesterday's announcement from the head of the coronavirus vaccine program in the US that the first doses of COVID-19 vaccine would be rolled out in the US as soon as mid-December?
It's hard to say. I really don't know what basis he had to say that. Probably he has an insider information, because what happens is, as I mentioned earlier, when a drug company develops a product and they release the data, like the way Pfizer and Moderna have done, they are not the final authority on this, so they have to give it to an independent body to review it. Now, this independent body is called the National Drug Regulatory Authorities. What that authority does is to look at the data that has been provided and completely analyze it, scrutinize it very carefully to look at safety, immune response, protection. So in the US, it's called the FDA, the Food and Drug Authority. So I would only be able to say that a vaccine would be available in mid-December if I have some preliminary information as to what the FDA is finding on the data that has been presented to them. So probably he is confident based on the information that he has from the Food and Drug Administration.
Right. Is it a fact, though, that a vaccine for COVID-19 that, for instance, is effective in the US may not be effective here in Africa or Asia, for that matter?
There is a possibility, and it is for that reason that people who develop this vaccine test it as wide as possible. So you mentioned that we have the Oxford vaccine being tested here in Kenya. It is for that reason that you try and include a diverse population, as diverse as possible. Now, the beauty though for Africans is that you also have African Americans, because our genetic makeup is essentially the same, so they can be able to test it amongst the African American population there. But it is not as convincing as if you have people of African descent tested within Africa, because one of the other things besides genetics, there are other things that can make a vaccine work or not work. Disease exposure. So you can have a black people in the US, for example, but they're not as exposed to other infectious diseases like malaria that we are exposed to. So it is of essence that manufacturers of vaccines test their products as wide as possible. And that is why I've been on the forefront, one of the people on the forefront, insisting that Africa should be able to participate in these vaccine trials. Even at the beginning, when people were saying that, oh, Africans should not participate, we should just wait for a product when it is found available. And there's this big story again about being used as guinea pigs, which I've already said at the beginning is a really an unfortunate terminology to use for people participating in vaccine trials. Remember when COVID came, they were expecting and there were predictions that Africa would be hit in a very bad way. And then, to the shock of everybody, they found that Africa was not devastated as much as the West was. And so people started asking themselves questions, what are some possibilities for this? And one of those was the temperature. They said, oh, Africa is warm, so the virus cannot be transmitted easily, or it dies in the heat. The other thing was genetics. Probably our genes being different protects us against COVID. The other thing was other exposures to other diseases, because we're exposed to many other diseases in Africa. Probably our body has generated some immunity. So when we're exposed to the virus causing COVID, we find it easy to fight it. But one of those was BCG, because Africa is one of the continents that has a very wide coverage of BCG, because TB largely is a disease of the tropics. And so Africa, all our children have been vaccinated with BCG and all that. So it was what we call an hypothesis. In science, when you think of a possibility, we call it a hypothesis.
There is an important note on the WHO website that says we must not rely on a future vaccine to fight this pandemic, but we must use all the tools that are already at our disposal, such as testing, contact tracing, physical distancing, hand washing, and the use of face masks. Would you like to emphasize this point, that we don't have a vaccine yet and must continue to observe the Ministry of Health guidelines on keeping safe?
The problem is that when people hear that there is a vaccine that is coming or that is available, The tendency is to put our guards down, and that is most unfortunate. As we say, the key thing about COVID is prevention, and they're very busy. It will take a while before we even get this vaccine, so we need to continue social distancing, wearing our mask, washing our hands, avoiding crowded places, and so on and so forth. Sanitizing where you can, if there is no water, if you have access to it, but soap and water is just as good. Because the reality is that a vaccine is a long-term solution. It will not even come to us. In my prediction, and I might even be wrong, is that the earliest that we can get a vaccine, COVID vaccine, in this part of the world would be towards the end of next year. And
Actually, that was my next question, Prof. It was going to be my final question, when a vaccine would be commercially available in your estimation.
The end of next year, but I wouldn't be surprised if it goes on up to 2022.
So we just have to stick to the basic Ministry of Health guidelines.
Definitely.
Thank you very much, Prof, for your time on the big conversation this morning. Talking about vaccines, looking at the efficacy, safety of people that volunteer, and of course, we've also talked about the soonest possible, according to Prof, in his optimism that a vaccine can be commercially available here in Kenya. And he says in his optimism, end of 2021 or 2022. Our special guest this morning has been Professor Walter Jaoko, Professor of Medical Microbiology and Tropical Medicine, University of Nairobi, and Director of the Kenya AIDS Vaccine Initiative.
The Breakfast Show 2020 on KBC English Service.